Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for joining this Guardian Live online event. My name is Lucy Siegle. I'm an environmental journalist and broadcaster, and I am chairing tonight's event. How is the climate crisis impacting the global food supply? It's a big question. I'll introduce you to our amazing panelists very shortly. Firstly, let me just give you a little bit of detail about how tonight's event works, how this platform works, and how the discussion will go. So we're going to be online for an hour, from 7 till 8 p.m. our time in the UK. I know we've got lots of people joining us from all over the world. And for the first 40 minutes, we'll be discussing how the climate crisis is impacting the global food supply with our expert panel. After that, we would love to take your questions. So there's a few different ways of doing this. Some of you've already sent your questions in. Thank you so much for those. You can also submit more if you've got more. So during the event, send us your written questions via the Q&A function on your screen on the side panel. We'll try and get to as many as we can. There's so many people here. Thank you. Thank you. I know there's lots of competition for your attention, so we're very pleased that you have joined us. With the questions, when you submit them, you can choose to be anonymous or tell us your name and where you're from. It's always fun, especially when people are joining us from all over the world. If your question is for a particular panelist, please write their name at the beginning of the question. Otherwise, I will allocate them as and when. Okay, would you like to meet our panel? I'm sure you would. Let's meet them. Okay, first of all, let me introduce you to Marike de Peña. Marike chairs the board of Fairtrade International, the world's largest and most recognized fair trade system. She is also the director and co-founder of Banalino, a banana cooperative comprising nearly 320 small farmers in the northwestern Dominican Republic. And she has held that position since 2000. And she joins us from the Dominican Republic this evening or this afternoon in her time. You're very welcome, Marike. Marike is also the chair of the Latin American and Caribbean Network of Small Producer Organizations, CLAC. And that's the Fair Trade Producer Network representing Latin American and Caribbean farmers and workers. We're going to be very producer-centric this evening, and that is purposeful. So we are so delighted to have you with us, Marike. Thank you very much. Our next panelist, who I'd like to introduce you to, is Esther, Stanford-Xosie, and Esther is a reparationist and jurisconsult. She serves as the co-vice chair of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and coordinates and facilitates a number of aligned organizations. In addition, Esther is co-founder of Extinction Rebellion's Internationalist Solidarity Network and a trustee of Plan B, which supports strategic legal action against climate change. Welcome, Esther. We're so delighted to have you with us this evening, speaking to climate justice and food justice and trade justice. And I know we're going to learn a lot from you about how aligned those issues are and, well, and presumably how aligned our responses need to be. So a very big welcome to you this evening. And last but no means least, we are joined by Professor Tim Lang. Tim Lang is Professor Emeritus of Food Policy at City, University of London Centre for Food Policy. He also founded that centre in 1994. His work has bridged education, science and governance, and he's been an advisor on food at the highest level, including the UN Environment Commission, UN World Health Organization, who he's consulted for, and many others. He's the author of 200 journals, articles, reports, and many books. I don't know if all of those behind you are your books. Oh no, 10 books. The most recent is Feeding Britain, Our Food Problems and How to Fix Them, which explores the meaning of food security for rich economies, arguing that developed countries are exceeding their food equity footprint. Well, what an apposite point to start on. You're very welcome, Tim. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've had a very, very busy day teaching. Well, we know that today is the first day of Fairtrade Fortnight, and also marks the publication of a powerful new report, A Climate of Crisis, Farmers, Our Food and the Fight for Justice. So this report throws into sharp relief the reality of producers in the Global South and the failure of both the government and private sector to protect small-scale producers from the impact of the climate crisis. So we are going to hear about this issue from all different perspectives. Remember to keep those questions coming in as well, because they're going to be really important. So the themes of tonight's discussion may be very familiar to you. As someone who's covered social and environmental justice for many years, I am, obviously familiar with them. But I can also say that the evidence of the extent of fragmentation in supply chains and the pressures that we experience also make me feel like the previous discussions that we've all had, they seem a bit leisurely, especially after reading the report from the Fairtrade Foundation today. And sometimes I think the story is just absent from mainstream debate, or so it feels in the UK. So again, we'd love to know your experiences wherever you are as well. So let's start from getting a sense from our panelists of where they think we are. Marike, I'd love to start with you. Could you give us an idea of the reality on the ground for some of the producers that you know, represent and work with? They've been hit, of course, by the global pandemic. So where, in terms of immediate threats, does the climate emergency sit for those producers?
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, where we currently are is, if you take the history of climate change, what you can see that the frequency of climate events is increasing. Before you could talk about the climate events every 10 years, currently we have several climate events during the last 10 years, and even one after another. Many producers are not coming out of a crisis. They're going from a hurricane crisis to a extended drought or to flooding. So it's one crisis after another. If you have checked recently, we had the most recent crisis we had in Latin America was in Central America, when a hurricane hit many of the main coffee producing countries just at the time when harvest was begun to start. So producers already had invested all their resources in getting a product ready for the market. And before starting the harvest, many of the coffee was simply lost and producers were not able to pay their debt. And knowing the coffee history, these same producers are just coming out of a coffee rust crisis that affected some years ago over 60% of coffee production. And the same I can say for the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is the country most affected by climate change. We are, well, there are not a lot of hurricanes that miss our countries. They come in and they go out. In 2017, even we were hit 2 times. We were hit in September by a hurricane that affected 30% of banana production in the Dominican Republic. We were able to find a collective loan. We started to plant again. Just starting planting, 3 months later, we had the other one, destroying everything again. And we needed to start another loan to get back to the market. So producers are really getting into debt through climate insurance. Not only that they lose all their income, because in our countries, when you don't harvest, you don't have income, and you cannot guarantee the food for your family, not the needs of daily life. So it's not just your farm you lose your income, you lose your security. Having said that, climate change is one of the many crises producers face. Because on the one side, we have climate change, which is increasing the cost of production, and it's decreasing our productivity and increasing also the diseases we face. But on the other side, we have very low commodity prices. So we have higher prices, lower commodity prices, and COVID hasn't really made it better because our cost of production have risen even more. The threats we face is definitely income, food safety for families, but also food safety globally, because if farming is not sustainable, food safety is not secured. Decent living is not guaranteed, increased poverty in farming communities, an increase in migration from rural areas to urban areas, the risk of human rights violations when families cannot cover their daily costs. And definitely, I think the most challenging one is that young people are not willing to take up agriculture for a living. As a safety net, thanks to Fairtrade, we can say we have the Fairtrade Premium as a collective fund that when crisis hit us, we can act at once and try to mitigate the immediate negative effect and have time to look for more sustainable solutions. On the other side, we should have had savings on producer levels, because climate change is not it's not a one-day event. It's coming back and back and back. So in some way, producers need to build savings to face these challenges that we know that will come back frequently. But due to this market situation, low prices, savings are rarely in place, and savings are needed for any climate change adaptations producers need to put in place.
Okay, thank you very much for that. You said that young people don't want to go into agriculture to make their living. From the story that you tell, it's not really surprising, is it? How would it be possible, do you think, to entice them back? I don't mean all the different ways, because we'll talk about remedies, but do you think that a whole generation is lost to agriculture now? Yeah, realistically.
It's definitely lost. If you see Latin America, the average age of a farmer is almost 60 years. So we already have lost the second generation partly because in Latin America and Africa and Asia, you are a farmer until you die, no? Because farming is the only way you can survive with your family. So the young generation, when they need to step into the farm, the parents still are trying to survive themselves from farming living. But on the other hand, with the global crisis, the multiple crises farmers are facing, and the markets that are going in the wrong direction, instead of paying sustainable prices in commodities are still very low and are not covering the cost of sustainable production, and even less the cost of living. So if we don't change this trend, it's very difficult to motivate young people to step into farming.
Okay, thank you. Esther, coming to you next. I mean, we've heard a catalogue of catastrophe, really. Was this somewhat inevitable given the origins of the system, and how do you relate to to Marike's observations about what producers are experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, for me, as a reparationist, which is really looking at how do we repair, this harmful sort of system that we're seeing that's causing all these disproportionate impacts, and that begins with acknowledging the root causes. So the root causes of the climate crisis, the root causes of the continued dispossession of small farmers, and the system of agribusiness that actually impoverishes them and actually denies their ability to benefit from their own labour in a fair way. And that system is called many different things, but we can't separate. If we see where the impacts are being felt the most and who is on the front lines producing our food, then we can't separate these patterns from historic patterns of colonization and land dispossession, which are continuing today. And then the powerlessness that results from that, the weak governance systems that make it actually much more easier for agribusiness to carry on this way that is very, very harmful to small farmers, and we're seeing the impacts of that in terms of their loss of livelihoods and also loss of ability to even farm in a way that is sustainable. And so we have to tackle root causes if we want to have effective solutions. And I know we're going to come on to talk about that. So that's how I would relate to it. And we're seeing that it's, as has already been said by Marike, it's kind of multiple crises combined together. It's not one thing, they're all multiplier effects, which are making it far worse.
What would you say was the top barrier for a society like ours? So we're both in the UK. Mm-hmm. From what's the main thing stopping from people acknowledging the root cause and having that conversation?
I think a large part of it is a lack of awareness about the global system and how we connect to that. And, you know, so people don't fully understand what are the costs of them being able to access particular food products in their local supermarket, you know, in terms of supply chains. We're not educated about that largely as a society unless you're involved in movements that are kind of raising this type of awareness. So people largely, I think, are not aware. What it would also take, in my view, is that we have to not only become much more aware, but we would have to be willing to change, especially in societies such as in the global north, our ways of living. And that's something I think is a lot more difficult for people to want to kind of fathom, in terms of people have got used to being able to access particular products at you know, cheap prices, and they have become used to that way of living. And so it is going to require fundamental change. But it's not impossible, because we've seen in history the role of communities, even in Britain. If I take the abolitionist movement, anti-slavery movement, when people in Britain became aware of what was the cost of, you know, having sugar in their teas in terms of enslavement of African people and indigenous people and their dispossession, that's what motivated a lot of ordinary people from the ground up to be part of those collective movements and protests and ways of resisting that way of life. So it is possible. There are lessons from history, including British history, that we should draw upon.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that it is possible. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Tim, I wanted to come to you. Esther mentioned cheap food there, and I wanted to ask you, how much does that drive for cheap food from the consumers? What part does that play in this? And I also wanted to ask you, in your book, Feeding Britain, you note that the UK has a homegrown food security problem, which I think many people are ignorant to. And how do those climate shocks, or the climate shocks, or the reality of what the producers are experiencing, how does that exacerbate our food security problem?
Well, those are enormous questions.
Yes.
Thank you. You're asking us, we're being asked to consider, all three of us, how is climate change and the climate crisis affecting food? Let me be very stark. Enormously, hugely, massively, but in a slow way that people, a bit like the lobster being put into a cold pot and then heated up, people haven't realized. But actually, it's getting very close to boil over time. The problem is, Lucy, and I think Esther and Marike have put it very eloquently, is that politics hasn't caught up with the science. The politics is not actually really addressing the enormous crisis food is adding to the climate change crisis. Climate change is being seen as something about energy, or as being seen about windmill power as opposed to nuclear power, as opposed to coal, as opposed to, is your car run on diesel or electric? It's not. It's about food. The climate change crisis is altering land. It's altering biodiversity. Food is the biggest user of land. It's the biggest user of water. It's the biggest labor source for the whole of the planet. It's the biggest employer. And for you, consumer, and me and us, Esther, Marike, you, Lucy, even saintly Lucy, your food is having a big impact on climate change. The emissions we're getting from food are massive. In a rich country, to come to the second part of your question to me, Lucy, rich country like Britain, you could say, what on earth? It hasn't got a food crisis, hasn't got a food problem, hasn't got a food security problem. It does, for the reasons that Esther and Marike, in different ways, were both pointing to. Britain is an imperial country no longer with an empire, but eating and living as it does. And it's eating beyond its limits. It's eating more than is good for its health. It's eating a distorted diet. It's turned food from being a source of life to a source of premature death and expensive healthcare. You couldn't make that up. We've got a major problem of which climate change is one major expression. For the developing world, for poor nations, food is a catastrophic, immediate pressure, and climate change is making that worse. For the rich world, food is a slow-burning problem of health, social inequalities, changing power relations within the food system, and the climate change crisis is making that worse. So I repeat my simple answer to the question you've posted, Lucy. How is the climate change crisis or the climate crisis affecting food? My answer is, the reality is huge, but the political leverage and Esther's point, the preparedness to change is not fast enough. Esther was putting it very eloquently. I'll be very stark. If we don't wake up and change our diets in the rich world, the poor world won't survive enough, and the rich world's catastrophe will be worsened. That's not me saying that. That's UN body saying that. That's the British Climate Change Act. That's the big Das Gupta report on the economics of biodiversity that came out a fortnight ago. It doesn't matter which body of science you go to, food is at the center of what's going wrong and also what we can do to put right. I'm actually an optimist, like Esther, I think. I'm an optimist that we can do things that put it right, and Marike too. I think we've got to undo a lot, and a post-imperial country like Britain has got a lot it's got to undo. We've got to start growing up and thinking much more carefully about what do we want from our food system. We've got to get more money going, not just to Dominican Republic banana growers, but to British farmers and rich world farmers. Everywhere, I see Marike nodding, and Esther, everywhere in the world, Lucy, primary producers get almost nothing of the money that urban consumers spend on food. There's going to be some transactional costs. Food doesn't just leap from a primary grower or fisher folk to a consumer's house. Costs are made, but the amount of money that gets to primary producers get them on a treadmill where they are exploited and being exploited and exploit the land and bad things accelerate. We've got to get off this treadmill, Lily. That's my answer.
Who is doing well out of this system?
Well, the money is mostly made by big farmers big food companies off. In the rich world, the dynamic is a fight for who makes the money between retailers, food manufacturers, and food service catering. In the US, food service makes more money than retailers do. In Britain, it's about third. You've got new kids on the block, delivery companies, gig workers, gig employment workers, big problem for social justice, concerns of Esther and indeed me too. They're making as much money as farmers doing. This is a sector that's only about 12 years old. You know, this is astonishing. There's a big problem, Lucy, for the policymakers worldwide. Do we take people to the food or the food to the people? How much distance do we want in that? What are the economic and ecological costs of the system we've created, where it's dependent on satellites, which are a cybersecurity threat, but don't let's go there. You know, this is a complex world food system, which is going to take a lot of change to change. But this year is a critical year. This event is a very good timing. We've got COP26 about ecosystems hosted by the Brits in Glasgow in November. We've got G7 meeting, again, hosted by the Brits in June, the 11th to the 13th. We've got the UN Food Systems Summit, which is very important for Marike, Esther, and people like us, happening in New York, probably virtually in September. This is a moment where we have to wake up, smell coffee, eat the banana, and consume differently and produce differently. We've got very few years to begin very radical change, Lucy.
I hear you, Tim. It's terrifying. I was interested that you used the phrase, we need to start being grown-ups, because I find that very resonant. You three are definitely grown-ups on this issue. And rather optimistically, I called this second section Remedies for a Sick System. You've started to mention some remedies, so let's flesh those out a little bit. Esther, what needs to shift? And you've already mentioned some examples of change that has happened before. You're telling us we can do it. What do you find the kind of most interesting ideas and remedies for the structural reform that's needed?
So for me, even though it's largely misunderstood, I think as a framework, reparations, and I don't mean reparations in terms of the narrow framing of financial compensation, which is only one aspect of a reparations framework. Reparations would involve, is a useful framework to use to think about the nature of the system that we have. How do we stop this type of extractivism that we're seeing that has harmful impacts, not only for farmers, but for people and for our planet and the ecosystems? But then what do we redress that with? Okay, how do we restore ecosystems? How do we restore land that has been despoiled? How do we restore more regenerative processes of farming that are sustainable? That is what I'm talking about in terms of a reparations analysis that has many different layers, and there are many who have been involved with food justice and food sovereignty movements who are utilizing a reparations framework. What does that concretely look like? What we know is that there are huge patterns of land injustice. We're talking about growing food and who has access to the lands, the most sustainable lands that can grow healthy food, that is localized, that can meet the needs, that is healthy and nutritious. Then we have to also recognize those historic patterns of land dispossession. So what a reparations framework or analysis would look at is land redistribution as well, recognizing that we have lots of knowledge from indigenous peoples around the world who have been living sustainably, who have been growing, farming sustainably for centuries. And in the areas that they have stewardship over, not the sense of private ownership and corporate ownership, we can see that there's much greater biodiversity protection. So those are some of the mechanisms that we need to look at seriously. Indigenous peoples have been talking about the need for restoration of lands and the recognition of the custodianship of those lands and how those lands should be utilized. That involves decolonization on large parts of the planet, where we still have these historic land patterns that privilege these big multinational corporations, agribusiness, and so forth. And that is a big picture solution that has systemic and structural impacts or legs to it. But if we don't have that overarching framework right, then everything else that we do will just be cosmetic or mere window dressing.
Okay, thank you very much for that very powerful intervention. Marike, this is obviously a question of survival for many producers. What do producers need to survive? How would something like living income make a dramatic difference? What do they need, and can things like the Fairtrade model supply it?
Well, definitely living income would be a solution, and because it would cover the basic needs of farmers and farming. But in the current situation, what we feel, many smallholders feel living income is a dream that never will come true. So I think we need to be very practical and find and build a strategy, and this is what we are trying to do in the Fairtrade movement anyway, to build a strategy to close the living income gap, which currently is growing. The gap is growing, it's not reducing. Because we already talked about the prices that are going down. COVID doesn't make it easier. Climate change is still a challenge. And on the other side, the market wants more for less. So we want to have the environmental perfect product and the social more responsible product, but we don't want to pay for it. So what we would need is like a fair trade at scale, because we all talk about fair trade and we have proven to be successful, but we are still small. So in some way, we need to make trade fair, and not only in for the 2 million producers, farmers and workers that are currently part of the fair trade system and not even able to sell 100% of their products on the fair trade terms. So it's a fair trade at scale. We have a price that covers the cost of sustainable production. We have a premium that is a safety net to invest in climate change challenges, as well as other challenges farmers face in their daily life. We have standards to build strong organizations and to guide for farmers and workers into more resilience producing. And we have the support on the ground to support farmers with climate-friendly technologies and other challenges. Having said that, I think there are short-term and mid-term actions that I see as an opportunity. In the Fairtrade network and amongst the indigenous people and farmers we serve, there's a lot of learning. We can learn from each other. We know what doesn't work, but we also know what works. And this is, we are very much focused currently on changing the way we produce our foods. I think that is something we can control ourselves. Making use of the learnings that we have as producers, small producers themselves. We need to focus far much on building healthy soils and make the soil resilient to whatever disease that can coming in, but also resilience to drought and the lack of water. We should increase the biodiversity and crop diversification. Biodiversity, because it's a natural way you increase the health of the soil, but crop diversification because it's not healthy to depend on one crop for your family to survive. And we have seen that even if the banana tree is dying, the cocoa tree is doing still very well. So if you just have one crop, you are more vulnerable than if you have crop diversification on your farm for export, for local market, for your family consumption. So crop diversification is the way to go. And also mixing activities. You can do more than just farming. You can do beekeeping. You can do poultry. So this kind of trying to get the most of your land, but in a healthy way, not exploiting your land. And on the midterm, I feel there are opportunities, but this needs a global debate. And I see a lot of opportunities in unfair trading practices. The European Union is currently taking up, I think, 16 unfair trading practices. Sadly, paying below the cost of production is not seen as an unfair trading practice still. But it is an unfair trading practices and it should be included. So in some way, we need to influence this. On the other side, we also need to sit down and revise the unintended consequences of anti-competition laws. because in some way it enable unhealthy competition that destroy family farming and disable farmers to adapt to climate change. Another opportunity, I think we have it with the human rights. Everybody is talking about human rights, national laws, global laws, and even talking about making companies responsible if they violate a human rights. But sadly, living income and living wage is not considered a human rights. But not having living income and not having living wage is probably the root cause of human rights violations. So it's an opportunity to include living income and living wage as a human right. So it can be regulated in some way through national laws and global laws. And finally, I believe we need to increase far more awareness about what we were able to do as Fairtrade as the simple solution to achieve a more fairer distribution of value in the supply chain, and put an end to price wars, which at the end will kill everybody, but also give more power to producers to negotiate better terms of trade. So fair trade needs to push for, not for another 25 years, because we don't have 25 years to solve the problem, but it needs to be seen as the solution for a problem that is already piloted, and we just need to scale it up.
Mm-hmm. Marike, thank you. As you know, everything I'm hearing is such a call to action, and it's so sort of powerful. By the way, just a very quick point. I do know of a piece of research that has proved that living wage is a human right in the global fashion sector, done by Jessica Stanford-Xosie, and I will send it to you. Maybe we can work on that. Thank you, Tim. I have so many questions, but I'm just going to let you do your thing. But one of the things that from what Marike said, how can paying below the cost of production not be seen as unfair? Could you explain that to me?
Well, it is unfair. It is unfair, and there's no justification for it. But as Marike was elegantly saying, it happens. Stuff happens. That's why you need good institutions of the state. You need auditing. You need accountability projects. You actually need short supply chains so that consumers can see what's happening for themselves. And that, can I say it as a living from a post-colonial country, it's very hard to do if you start getting fed from the other side of the world. I mean, the Brits put sugar and bananas and rubber and all sorts of crops and turned the people through slavery and other things that Esther was referring to into dependent economies. A sustainable economy, a fair trade economy, wouldn't look like a little bit of tweaking here and there on what we've got already. I want to actually shift, if I can, Lucy. Esther and Marike have very understandably been focusing on farming. It's very important. But I want to focus on the majority, which is consumers in urban areas. The world is no majority rural world. It's a majority urban world where people are fed by others in a declining percentage of the population. It's going well, population is going up, but actually it's the towns and cities that matter. And no one will talk about that adequately. Consumers have been inducted into a fantasy food culture that progresses having more of everything whenever we like, wherever it's from, and as cheap as possible. Your question. The answer is that doesn't add up for reasons we've said, and many reports and academics and people have pointed out for decades. This is not new insight. The point is, why will no policymaker, the challenge I have for our audience, for you, for me, for us, Lucy, is why will policymakers not face consumers and say, dear fellow consumers, we cannot go on doing this. It's not climate change is going to be resolved, or biodiversity, or land use, or water pollution, or it's not going to be sorted out by someone else. It's you. It's how you are eating. It's how you are controlling what happens by participating in it in this way. And there is a gap. I wrote down in my notes here, mismatch. There's a gap between what we know the impact of the food system is having on society, on economies, on human health, on public health, on populations, on jobs, and what it ought to be coming. We've got to narrow that gap. That's a political problem, to be honest, Lucy. It's not fair trade, it's not to resolve this. Let me be very frank. Having a fair trade banana ain't going to resolve that problem. The issue has got to be mainstream political agenda. And the world is sort of waking up to that. I mentioned the G7. It had a wake up of the G78, actually with the banking crisis 2007-8. Suddenly the rich world said, holy Moses, it's not just Africa's problem, it's our problem. They suddenly worried. Great, they were right to worry. But that worry has gone off the boil. Now they're getting a bit worried about climate change, possibly a little bit about biodiversity. They've got to wake up very fast indeed. And we as consumers, Lucy, have a responsibility in that. I would always say to my friends in fair trade, of whom I have many, I would say, you are just the first step on a massive leap that's got to happen. We've got to hit the mainstream of British, European, American consumers to say, how we eat is not a sustainable diet. Which government gives advice? Who gets advice as a consumer of what's a good diet to eat for biodiversity or for climate change or whatever? No one else. The Swedish government, Lucy, gave advice in 2008 and it was made to withdraw it by the European Food Safety Agency. And bless the Swedes, they came back 5 years later and said, well, we'll give cultural advice. I agree with them. This is about our culture. We expect so much. We've made progress be defined as more, more, more. Actually, for the rich world, it's less, less, and better. Less, but better. Less meat and dairy, but better. Eat a bigger range of foods, but don't have it out of season. Very different messages we need to start having. That's what I want from the policymakers. And they're not going to do it unless we push them to do it. So it's events like this, Lucy, Esther, Marike. This is where we have to say to our fellow citizens, whoever you are, wherever you are, use whatever influence you've got. We've got to have a food system in the 21st century, which is sustainable diets from sustainable food systems. That's not what we've got, Lucy.
I'm getting that message. Thank you, Tim. We have had a lot of questions. We're going to leap into taking some questions now. From a lot of people saying, what can we do as consumers, which I think you have just answered very well. But I think this is a follow-up question from Colin Ross. What do you think is the most effective way to raise awareness and engage the widest possible public audience about the critical issues that you've just explained? In fact, Tim, you and I had a short conversation the other day about what was on TV in the UK and how most food programs, well, I mean, there is no suggestion in most of the food output that I watch that there are any sort of problems whatsoever.
Many. I'm going to be very sort of politely rude. You know, I'm an academic. I appear on TV programs, but the problem is they're so much they act like they're like wallpaper. We watch them and then we're off to the supermarket and we're happy with 30,000 items. This is actually, consumers are overwhelmed by choice. There's too much choice. They don't want it. They're not sure. That's why I was saying earlier, Lucy, we need better cultural rules, cultural guidance. What do we do? In the COVID-19 crisis, governments all around the world are telling their people what to do. It won't be about food and climate change or food and biodiversity. And yet there's a similar crisis, but it's running slower, so people don't see it, that needs new cultural rules. I'm in a rich world country. It overeats meat and dairy. Meat and dairy is produced in the most ecologically sound way. We should have less of it. We need vastly more horticulture in Britain, sustainably done. At the moment, Britain just uses other people's land and labour to get the good things for health, and then exports over-processed, sweet, fatty, sugary foods and gives up these to the world. This is not a good joined-up policy system. But I'm so pleased that people are asking on that show, on the chat line, about consumers. I think we've actually got to do some very big thinking, and in countries like Britain, put pressure on our politicians. What are the cultural advice for a sustainable diet? We know that 25% of greenhouse gases is to do with, of those, that 25%, 50% of that, so 12.5%, is just from consuming meat and dairy. You know, do we carry on doing that? Is that the way forward? No, it isn't. But will government say reduce? Will government start saying, well, we shouldn't be doing this? Will government start get a grip of land use? No, it says, oh, well, leave it to Tesco et al. That's what I call the leave it to Tesco et al. Reflex. That's not good enough. It's not grown up, Lucy. It's childish. It's stupid. And it's not in anyone's self-interest to allow that to carry on in any country in the world. And it's not a model of the future that passes the laugh test.
Okay, I'm just one more question, which is very specific, as you welcomed questions about being a consumer. Karen Hans asks, should I now try to buy local Yorkshire food, or is it still important to support global trade to ensure income reaches the global south? For example, should I replace my daily cup of coffee with a mint tea from mint that I can grow myself? How literal should Karen go?
Well, with Karen, I think you should go for that. But having said that, Professor Lang here has 1 cup of coffee a day, because we know the evidence for coffee and human health is pretty good. Don't overconsume it. So dramatically reduce the amount of coffee you have. Every cup of coffee, about 140 litres of embedded water. It's not a great commodity to have unless you can guarantee you are having a fair trade coffee. So I think drink more mint tea from your garden or from your local area or wherever you are, and consume a very nice quality coffee very infrequently. In other words, only 1 a day, not the rocketing rocketing consumption. And the same for tea, the same for bananas. I like bananas. It's Britain's favourite fruit, Marike, you'd be glad to know. But well, I don't like touching them unless they're fair trade.
Let's ask Marike then, because presumably you don't want people to stop consuming fair trade, because surely the idea is that they shift as much as possible in your direction.
Yes, I think we need a healthy mix in consumption. It cannot be just local nor just global, but whatever we consume, it needs to be sustainable for northern and southern farmers. And also in the south, we should not stop being completely depending on export. I think we need to work on both ends. Southern farmers also need to invest in local market and local consumption. And also our countries need to take up fair trade as the way to go. So it's not about north-south. We always will have a north-south connection. The only thing, the connection needs to be far more healthier than it's currently, because it's still quite a lot based on exploitation, socially and environmentally. But having the right mix of local and global consumption, caring about that whatever your supply chain you have is sustainable, I think this is the right way forward.
Okay, I have a question for you while I have you, which follows nicely. How do you visualize the shift towards fair trade on a larger scale? You just mentioned that countries, I think you said like yours, should just be completely fair trade. Is that where you see the growth coming from? How would you scale?
I would say fair trade. If we want to scale up fair trade, we need to talk about it as being we have trade and we have fair trade. We need to make trade fair, and that is the main objective. Wherever we do trade, if it's in our communities, in our countries, or globally, but in some way, the last 30 years of fair trade has been the pilot that whatever we have done is functioning. And if you ask producers and you asked about which scheme give them sustainability, security, and has enabled them to stay active in agriculture, probably they will say it's fair trade. Because fair trade has some components that build this security and empower producers to stay in farming. But this should be far more broader. We have many farmers still not being part of fair trade. So in some way, it's very clear that we cannot leave fair trade open or trade open without any regulation, because fair trade is regulating trade, is regulating also the relationship between farmers and their trade partners. So in some way, if we think we can keep on trading our product without regulations by our governments globally, it simply doesn't work. It ends up with more poverty and more disequality. So regulations are needed, and it's time to accept it.
Okay, thank you very much. Interesting you talk about relationships. We've got lots of questions that are based around relationships with different parts of this supply chain. Esther, Zoe Jones would like to know, what can international development organizations do to engage with reparations frameworks and make sure they're contributing to the goal of food justice in our work? What do they need to change?
Well, first of all, it's about listening to the movements for reparatory justice and what they're saying, and also the examples of good practice of those who are organizing at the intersections of these interconnected movements. So there are many initiatives in the global north, and there are many initiatives in the global south. And I think it's about recognizing, as the point was made earlier by Marike, the knowledge that is being generated, that is already there. It's about linking with these movements and their kind of organizing networks and so forth, amplifying their voices and actually co-envisioning and prefiguring that kind of future that we need to bring about in order to ensure and guarantee our sustainability and our livelihoods as well. So that's what I would say. There's a lot of work already happening with international NGOs who are talking about reparations framework. So look at where that practice is happening and see how you can tap into that.
Okay, thank you very much. Claude Bourdin asks, is there a chance to increase the political response to the challenge concerning food by having the political establishment listening to and meeting with not only specialist expert and lobby groups, but with farmers themselves? Claude is the international coordinator for Farmers Dialogue. Who would, Marike, what? Yes, we should surely be involving farmers.
Yes, please. And not only political. Farmers are the ones that are suffering quite some negative consequences of climate change and other challenges. And probably they are that we know better reality, and we also are part of the solutions. So I think strengthening this voice is key in designing policies and in designing regulations, but also in the governments of whatever that is linked to climate change. So making producers part of the solution is key, because any other solution simply won't work. The ones that suffer the consequences in their daily life know best how to grow out of it. So please make farmers part of the solution and listen to the experience farmers have to find pathways towards a better future.
Thank you. Yes, you would think so, wouldn't you? You would. That is logical. Tim, did you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, obviously, I agree with that, and well said, Marike. The only thing is, in some countries in the rich world, they've listened too much to farmers, and the policymakers have listened to a particular sort of farmer, and there hasn't been a voice for consumers. There hasn't been a voice for ecological farmers. There hasn't been a voice for horticulture, but there has been for big meat barons. One thinks of the United States, that we have to be careful of just saying, talk to farmers. Of course, farmers do know, and they have to be part of solutions. But I repeat, there has to be a framework. I very much agree with Esther on this, a reparation or regeneration agenda, very fast, of aiming for the world, whether you live in Malawi or in North America, whether you live in Latin America in a difficult climate, or you live in Italy or Spain with a Mediterranean climate. We've got to have a notion of sustainable diets, healthy, environmentally sound, socially just diets, and the signals going to the farmers. The problem is just talking with the farmers. Well, the politicians say they do it all the time, but they only talk to some farmers of a particular school, a particular approach. That isn't actually going to be the answer to the food crisis of climate change or biodiversity or social justice. We actually need institutions, Lucy. In 1943, the Hot Springs Conference laid out a plan for post-Second World War food and farming. We need a hot springs for today, where actually, and that's what the UN Food Systems Summit is supposed to be. So it's up to us to make it that, to help it and to push it and to make sure it's.
We're coming very close to the end now. So I wondered if we could have a sort of final thought. And I know it's really irritating when people ask you to do this, but could you give a final thing that all of the people that have joining us, 1,300 people who've attended tonight, what is a takeaway message of something that they can do, one thing that they can do? It may or may not be Fairtrade Fortnight related, Marike. Okay, Marike, would you like to go first?
I think the message is clear. We need to change the way we produce and consume our food. So that is, around that, we need to build our future.
That's big homework. Thank you. Esther.
We need to look at supporting the development of farming at the local levels. We need to encourage younger generations to feel connected to land and being on land, because our food comes off of the earth. We need to regenerate ourselves as a people, and that for me is about the repairs, there's a responsibility for us to engage at self-repair at every level, as well as the institutions and the corporations and governments and so forth. But let's all identify and make sure that we're part of the solutions rather than furthering the problem that we've been talking about.
Okay, thank you. Tim.
I agree with that. Well said, both. Lucy, it was about 1,405 attendees, by the way. It was astonishing. Events like this are wonderful, where we discuss, where we think, where we talk. We need more of that. In terms of immediate, me as an individual consumer, or you, or our families, or whatever, our friends, for the rich world, eat simpler. Eat simpler. Have feast day foods only on feast days, not every day. If you're in the poor world, well, it's a very different message. Demand more, push more, in the way that we've all been talking about. It's a complex food system, Lucy. It's not simple. But if we don't address food, what Marike said is absolutely right. My language for this is sustainable diets from sustainable food systems. If you don't do it, we're all done for.
Thank you. I wish we had more time. It is very stark. It's very stark, but I mean, honestly, I do get some sense of a lot of solutions from all of you, and I really thank you for that, because yes, as Tim said, what an enormous amount of people have come along tonight to engage in this debate. I cannot stress highly enough how good it would be if you read the new report from the Fairtrade Foundation, A Climate of Crisis, Farmers, Our Food and the Fight for justice. And also, if you haven't, you should read Tim's book. It is just such an important wake-up call, Feeding Britain, Our Food Problems and How to Fix Them. Thank you to all of our panelists. Marike, Esther and Tim, what an extraordinary privilege it's been for me to get to speak with you. It was such a large question, but I honestly feel like I think you had a really good go at answering it. So I take my hat off to you, and I can't thank you enough. And most of all, I want to say thank you to the huge audience that has attended and engaged, and thank you for all your questions as well. I really hope that you enjoyed the discussion, and maybe even some of your questions got answered. We never have enough time, do we? Most of all, I want to say thank you to the Fairtrade Foundation for supporting this discussion. Without you doing that, it wouldn't have happened, obviously. And I hope you have a great Fairtrade fortnight. There's so much going on. There are so many really important debates to be had. And if you want more information on Fairtrade Fortnight, we'll put that up on the closing slide, but if you've got to go immediately, it's fairtrade.org.uk/festival, but hold for the slide. If you enjoyed tonight and you like this kind of provocative engagement, please come back. We have lots of Guardian Live events, as you know. You can find out about more of them if you go to theguardian.com/Guardian Live. Now, a short survey will pop up at the end of this very shortly. It is short. Please complete it if you can, because it really helps us with our programming. And finally, a video of this event will be sent to you all within a week. That's a Guardian guarantee. It's written here, within a week. So chase them up if it hasn't arrived. So that is it. Huge thank you to our panelists. Please fill in the little survey. Thank you for coming. I'll see you next time.